aspects in the 1632 universe or naval aspects of the 1632 universe. What this is going to be is a discussion of how the what has become the very important naval side of the 1632 series came to be in existence. Because when I wrote 1632, first of all, I never intended it to be the first book in a series. It was intended to be a standalone novel. But insofar as I had ever given any thought to where the story might go from there, I had started it in the region of Germany known as Thuringia, which, for those of you who have some knowledge of Central European geography, Thuringia is the region, the very southernmost part of what used to be East Germany is the best way to report it. It's on the border of what used to be Czechoslovakia, is now the Czech Republic. The point being, it is nowhere near any significant body of water other than some rivers. And I really had no idea at all in my mind that I was going to wind up doing a series that has several books in which naval warfare, ships, and whatever feature extremely prominently. So, how did it happen? Well, here's how it happened. In 1632 came out in the year 2000, February 2000. And I don't remember exactly where or how David Weber and I encountered each other. We were both published by Bain Books, so that was the nexus that got us together. But I don't remember how it all started. David may, but I just don't. But what happened was that David asked me to write a story for one of the anthologies he was producing in the Honor Harrington universe. And it was the third one, if I recall correctly. And I wrote a short novel called From the Highlands, which introduced some characters that have since become very prominent in the series. And that's how David and I first started working together. At that point, Jim Bain had approached me and urged me to turn 1632 into a series.
Can't imagine Jim doing that.
Yeah, I know. And to be honest, I did not intend it to be the first book in a series. I wrote it as a standalone novel, and I was a little bit wary of the idea because I normally work in series, but I also know the danger of series, that they can wind up just being kind of pointless. It's always easy for an author to figure out how to invent new things to happen. That's not hard, but any good story has a point to it, and what's the point of just having more adventures? And one of the great cautionary tales, I guess you could call it, that I've always been aware of is that many years ago, Gordon Dixon wrote a fantasy novel called The Dragon and the George, which is an absolutely marvelous novel. And for anybody who's read it, it's just a wonderful book.
It is.
Yeah, it is. But later in his life and career, I don't know why, probably just he needed some money, but he turned it into a series. And the problem is this wonderful first book would have done a lot better just being left alone, because the sequels that follow, I mean, they're not bad. You know, he was a good writer, but there's just no real point to them. They just, this adventure happens and that adventure and the other adventure. And I really didn't want that to happen with the 1632 series. So after thinking about it, I decided I could make it work. It was kind of a gamble, but I could make it work if I made it completely open-ended and drew other authors into it, and we would just see how this thing would unfold. It would be, every other series I work in, I know how they end. I'm not going to tell you, but I could. And I even have written a series that did end, the Belisarius series. But the 1632 series is not like that. It's completely open-ended. There is no end in sight for it. And that's partly how it works, is just keep unfolding and doing various things. Anyway, I think it was Jim that proposed to me asking David Weber if he would co-author the next novel with me. And the reason was coldly commercial on Jim's part, which was that if Yeah.
I think actually that might be flipped, Eric, because I think what happened was that we were going to do the collaboration that in the Honorverse that launched off of from the Highlands. And I think that was the first thing that Jim proposed. And then I said that I would be delighted to let you play in my sandbox as long as I got to play in yours.
Okay, yes, you're right. Yeah, because Crown of Slaves, which was the first novel in the Honorverse that David and I wrote together, came out very soon after 1633.
Mm-hmm.
1633 came out in August. I wrote all this down. It came out in August 2002, and Crown of Slaves came out a year later.
Yeah.
And I remember now, yes, what happened was David told me, he said, I've always wanted to write an ironclad story. And quite obviously, it would be awfully hard to fit ironclads into this Honor Harrington series. You know, I mean, try to imagine ironclads before Shosky sails. It just doesn't work. Um, and I, I thought, first of all, I thought it'd be a whole lot of fun to write with David. I also knew it would boost the series. I did, however, have one reservation, which is I had read by then quite a bit of David's writings. And what was obvious to me is this was a man who really liked his gadgets, especially his military war machines, especially his military vessels. And, and I spent a great deal of my life working in basic industry, most of it as a machinist. And I have a dour and pessimistic view of just how well machines and metal do when you first try to make something out of them. And you know, you wouldn't believe the stuff that goes wrong. So when I told David, and also I was having a tug of war, I don't want to call it a conflict because it never got that sharp, but I was having a conflict with Jim Bain over the direction in which to move the 1632 series, because what Jim really wanted me to emphasize was the enormous impact of modern American military technology on the world of the 17th century. And I really, that wasn't where I wanted to go with the series. And it's that military technology is very important because it's what enabled that small town to survive, number one, and secondly, to actually develop quite a bit of leverage politically. But what I was really more interested in was the sort of political and social developments that would follow from it. And so what I didn't want, I said to David, is said, okay, so we negotiated. We settled that he could have 4 ironclads. And I knew he was going to make these the best ironclads anybody had ever seen. I knew he would. And I said, okay, but one of them has to sink. One of them has to have major problems, and they can't be too seaworthy because, you know, it's okay if they dominate the Baltic, but I don't, you know, want these damn things sailing one of them across to the New World and sinking the entire Spanish fleet, you know.
Oh, it would have been fun.
Anyway, that was the basis on which we started, and we wrote 1633. And then what happened was that Crown of Slaves came out shortly thereafter, and then David had already proposed to me that we turn the character of of John Simpson, who is he's not exactly a villain in the first book, but he certainly, he's not one of the good guys. And David recommended that we actually transform him in the course of the second book and make him one of the heroes. I mean, you know, without changing his character so that it'd be ridiculous. And I like the idea because I've been starting to think what I want to do with Simpson. And, you know, just keeping him the way he was would have been kind of boring, to be honest. So I like the idea of, in a way, Simpson becomes a kind of Tukhachevsky figure, I guess you could call him. And that's how we developed them in 1633. But what David did was write a novella that bridged the 2 books and showed the initial evolution of John Chandler Simpson. And that story is called In the Navy. and it appeared in the first Ring of Fire anthology, which came out in 2000, early 2004.
I think it showed partly the evolution of Simpson. It also showed partly the discovery of Simpson by an evolving Eddie.
Yes, yes, it did. It
Yeah,
did.
yeah,
It's mostly actually told. Yeah, the whole story is mostly told from Eddie's point of view,
yeah.
and you reach a point where, somewhat to his chagrin, even horror, he begins realizing that that, oh Christ, I'm going to become this guy's, I'm his guy,
Yeah.
because whatever he thinks of Simpson, in fact, he's quite effective
Yeah.
as a naval leader, which is what he actually wanted to be all along
Mhm.
anyway. He just, for family reasons, wound up running a family business. Anyway, the next story we did, not together exactly, but working back and forth in our mutual in different universes, I wrote a follow-up to from the Highlands called Fanatic, which appeared in the next anthology. And what that did was try to explain the evolution of the character of Victor Kasha from where you first see him in From the Highlands to the much more mature and pretty effective and ruthless character you see in Crown of Slaves. So that story came out. And then finally we got around to doing the third volume in the series, which is 1630 for the Baltic War. Now that came out in May of 2007. The point being there was a 5-year gap between 1633 and the Baltic War.
Mhm.
And in the meantime, I wrote 2 novels with Andrew Dennis, The Galileo Affair and the sequel, The Canon Law. And this got kind of awkward because when David and I left the American mission to England in the Tower of London in captivity at the end of 1633, in the canon law, which is published before Baltic War, they have somehow escaped.
They've been busted out.
They busted out. And it's like, how did this happen? And the way we solved it was, I remember writing an episode in which they're starting to explain it to somebody. Oh, you wouldn't believe what happened, and then something happens, and the story gets broken. But it was awkward, And I said to Jim, I said, geez, I guess we're just going to have to sit on the novel until David and I can get Baltic War finished. And Jim Bain, he said, are you kidding? You think we're going to sit on a publishable novel that's going to sell well just because it's, screw that. We're going to publish it. He said, you figure out how to deal with that
Yeah,
problem.
it's your world. You fix it.
He said, trust me, Eric, in 3-4 years, nobody will remember. And he was right. Nowadays, nobody remembers.
Yeah.
The problem, though, that was starting to emerge was that the next thing David and I did together was in 2009 when we wrote the sequel to Crown of Slaves, Torture Freedom. And that was the same year I met Chuck. I met Chuck early in 2009 at Lunacon, a convention in New York. And we hit it off. And I asked Chuck if he would like to work with me in the 1632 series. I was, by then I had a problem, which was that Andrew Dennis and I had done the first 2 books in what came to be called the Italian line, the Galileo Affair and the Canon Law. But then Andrew developed medical problems, so we had contracts for 2 more books, and he just couldn't keep going at that moment. So what happened basically was Chuck took over from that, and the end product of that it was Chuck and I wrote the final 2 books, the Papal Stakes and then later the Vatican Sanction. And then Andrew and I later wrote a different project, and we're about to start on yet another one.
No wonder you have to write this stuff down.
Yeah, I did. I really actually had to go back because I couldn't trust my memory anymore. This is 15, 20 years ago or 10 years ago anyway. But here's the point. What became, by this point, David and I had 6 contracts together for 6 novels, 3 in the Honor Harrington universe and 3 in the 1632 universe. And the 3 that David was going to work with me on in the 1632 universe were all naval stories. They were going to continue to develop the whole naval aspect that we had begun in 1633. The problem was that I started cogitating on this somewhere between 2010 and 2013. I don't remember exactly when, but here's the problem. David and I are both quite successful authors, and that means we're busy. And we have lots of work on our plates. And trying to get our schedules to mesh so we could do a book together is not easy. And I realized it's happening about once every maybe 3 years we can do it.
Yeah.
And I, by that point, I was, I hadn't been a spring chicken for quite a while, but by that point, I was well into my 60s, and I did some calculations, and I called David up, and I said, David, at the rate we're going, by the time we start the last book that we have under contract, I will be, I estimate, around 85 years old. Which is probably pushing it. Hopefully, I'll still be around and still active. But I said, I don't think this is going to work. So we discussed it, and we discussed it with Tony Weisskopf, who's by then the publisher of Bain Books. And what we agreed was that we would keep the 3 Honor Harrington books that we would continue to work on. The reasons for that, as is so often the case in publishing, being grossly commercial. The Honor Harrington series is Bain's best-selling series by a country mile, and that's going to always have the priority. So, and then we took the other 3 and we rolled. Never mind. There are ways authors and publishers can do this. It's messy, and
Don't talk about the sausage. Don't talk about the sausage.
But what I was left with, however, was still the problem that I had these 3 novels that David had already done quite a bit of work on preparing for, and they needed to be done, So at that point, we approached Chuck and asked Chuck if he would basically take them over from David, and if he would write them, which he did. And the first one that he and I finished was which came out a few years back, was 1636 Commander Cantrell in the West Indies. The second one is coming out in November. It's called 1637 No Peace Beyond the Line. And the third one we will be writing fairly soon, because it will be the next mainline novel following on Polish Maelstrom, which came out last year.
And then there's another one in the Caribbean that is tentatively titled War to the Knife.
Which I say that, oh, yeah.
War to the Knife, which is the
yeah. We have another one there, right. So I have talked long enough. I am now going to hand over to the 2 of you to explain how you manage the transition, because I know the 2 of you work together quite a bit to get, David pass on what he'd collected, because he'd done a lot of research on it, and pass it on to Chuck and where it went from there. So you're on.
Gee, dang, boss. Yeah. Okay. Well, interesting side story. One of my best friends is Jane Linscoe, who I met for the first time at a Magnum Opus Con when she was talking about the literary biography of Rogers and Lastney that she'd done. And then my 78 Volvo swallowed its timing gears just outside Lynchburg when I drove up for a convention. So I wound up being her house guest for like 11 days, kind of thing, while they demothballed the production line in Sweden, made the parts and shipped them over by Windjammer, kind of thing. And in the midst of all this, I was a gamer, and Jane and I were talking about gaming, and she was talking about a gaming group that she used to be in, way back when. And one of the guys in it was this guy named Chuck Gannon. So when Chuck came across my horizon, I was like, "You're Chuck Gannon." And also I think Chuck has been working with Steve White in the Starfire universe, which was another collaboration that was languishing in large part because my schedule had gotten so out of whack. So when the possibility of Chuck moving in to take over the 1632 naval line came along. It was like I was dealing, when the suggestion was made, it wasn't like this was an unknown quantity that we were talking about. Okay, it wasn't like, yeah, I found this guy, wandering around drunk down on, and I thought I'd bring him in. So I was like, okay, good. This is somebody that I can feel comfortable handing the storyline off to, and not worry about, it's about Eric not getting the support that he needs on this part of the book, and not worry about the fact that the storyline would tank somehow if I took my hands off the wheel. Now, Eric is correct that he specified that the ironclads had to have a certain degree of fragility. I didn't give him fragility. What I gave him was blow one up with a mine, and other things like that there. But one of the challenges was how you were going to propel the ironclads, because one thing that Granville didn't have was a bunch of heavy industry. It wasn't like they had a foundry out back that they could go and make a reciprocating steam engine from. And I thought about, say, okay, well, we'll take some of the mining truck engines and use them to turn propellers. But then I thought, they really need those trucks for transports. Okay. And then I thought, they got these pumps down in the mine. And so basically I built jet ski ironclads. They work by pumping water out the back, because what really drives any wet Navy ship is displaced water coming out the back and pushing it forward. And that led to some interesting possibilities for what these ships could do, and also some interesting vulnerabilities. Because they were basically a tunnel drive ship, they didn't have to worry about breaking a prop blade on an underwater obstacle. And also, a lot of people don't realize how difficult it is to design a large vessel's propeller to be efficient. Even today, it's like they try a design in one of the flow dynamic tanks to see whether or not it's going to work before they actually build the damn thing to full size, because they can do all the calculations they want, and sometimes it still just doesn't work out the way they had in mind. In the U.S. Navy's experience, the most catastrophic problem that they probably had was with the North Carolina class, because the vibration that built up in its machinery when it approached anywhere near 20 knots practically shook the ship apart, and they spent years trying different combinations of propellers and everything else. And so I'm like, I don't think I want to get into putting propellers on these guys if there's a way around it. So that's how we came up with the tunnel drive. Now, I don't think Eric mentioned the cover of that book. Because we actually had a problem, which was that the artist gave us, in effect, a pre-dreadnought battleship from like 1905, and what we're talking about is something a lot more akin to the Virginia or the Merrimack from the American Civil War, like a barn floating out there, and they're casement ironclad. And so we're like, what do we do now? And Eric and I kind of talked it over, and I think it was Eric who came up with the brilliant plan of having a painting in the Admiral in Simpson's office, which had been commissioned, I think, by his wife, but it was a guy who had done his research in the Grantville Library, and this is what he thought we were going to build. So there's actually a description of why you have this painting hanging on the wall in Simpson's office to be the cover of the book, which I thought was like,
I remember when Jim showed us the cover.
Yeah.
I remember calling you and saying, oh, Christ. So I called Jim up. I said, Jim, yeah, it's a very nice cover, but
it's wrong.
This is, I mean, this is like a World War, not quite World War I, but this is a dreadnought. You know, I mean, this isn't an ironclad.
Yeah.
And Jim's response was, "That's your problem."
Yeah, okay, that's Jim. That's
They
Jim.
said, "Hey, you're the author. You figure out how to solve the problem."
Well, well, really and truly for me, even more than the technology, which you're right, I do like the boys and their toys. But to me, it was a lot more the relationship between Simpson and the personnel of this Navy that he was building, and specifically his relationship with Eddie, who was in the process of becoming the surrogate for the son that he was estranged from. Um, Simpson Simpson has always struck me as sort of a tragic figure in a lot of ways because he's just not good with people. Okay. Um, and yet, when he is performing at his best, he is excellent with people. Okay. It's just that he has to be doing something that requires him to actually dig in and be him rather than the stuffed shirt from Pittsburgh, you know? Um, and that was a huge part of why I wanted to write the books.
Yeah.
Was to, and there's a point that I'm I'm I know it's been made elsewhere, but I think this may be the first book that in the series that it was actually made in, which is that the most conservative imaginable American from the 20th century has more in common with the most radical leftist imaginable from the 20th century than either of them has with somebody from the 17th century.
Yep.
And I think one of the strengths of the Grantville books, and I think particularly as polarized as we are right now, one of the strengths of the Grantville books is that sense of a consensus basis, a wholeness to that community. Okay. Um, but at the time that we wrote these books, I don't think either of us foresaw as where we were going to be heading in terms of polarized American politics in the 21st century. But to me, that's one of the great attractions of the universe. On a purely naval front, I have been a naval historian for 50 years now. And I don't know if that shows in what I write. I mean, I suppose it might. And being allowed to play with completely redoing the naval history of the 17th century with the input from these lunatics from the 20th century, I was like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, I could do this. I could do this. So I did sit down and start pulling together my notes to put the entire naval thread in place. And looking at what they could realistically do with the resources that they brought back from the 20th century and what they could build in the 17th century. And the temptation in something like this is to build some beyond cutting edge technology for the century you find yourself in. But you can't do that, not and play fair with the universe in which you're writing and the reader. It has to be something that is attainable, that doesn't require God or the author to reach in and say, oh, we just discovered that hidden in the warehouse over at the mine were these 4 steam plants to go into an ironclad. No, it has to be something that they can do. And the joy in a lot of ways is finding ways to accomplish what you need to accomplish without just tossing causality out the window. Okay, so I was doing a bunch of going back through and pulling together the evolution of the sailing navy the evolution of the early sailing ships with auxiliary steam propulsion and so forth. There's no reason why they couldn't build steam engines in 1632 just as well as in 1785 or 1800 once they knew how to do it. But
you're right. We have there's a whole separate line of the series takes place in Tsarist Russia,
mm-hmm.
and the Russians, as they have all through history, really jumped on steam technology. The machines are crude. The tolerances are really wide.
But see, the thing is, if you look at the early auxiliary maritime steam engines, they were really crude. The tolerances sucked. They ran on maybe 60 pounds per square inch of pressure. They weren't really efficient, but by golly, that ship could move against the wind, okay, which was just wow, It gave a degree of tactical flexibility that had gone out the window with the oared galley. And looking at an opportunity to incorporate that into the naval battles of the 17th century was just like, okay, I remember when we had to do the whole storyline with the Brits turning their coats when the battle began and everything. I had so much fun writing that whole thing, which didn't have an ironclad or a steam engine in sight. You know what I'm saying? But so I pulled all these notes together, and I had myself organized on the technological side of where we were going, but we didn't know yet where we would be going politically or diplomatically because of the way that this whole series has evolved. So when Chuck stepped in, he was moving into an area of the interactions of humans that was beyond anything that Eric and I had discussed in any detail at all going forward. So what I could offer him was, okay, here's my notes on how the hardware side of this works. And we corresponded back and forth, Chuck, bunches.
You provided me with conservatively, I want to say about 47,000 words of research. There were also a variety of diagrams.
For people who don't know, that's about half a novel.
Yeah. Well, except for, of course, then Commander Cantrell certainly made you
half of a normal.
Yeah. About a third of a David Weber novel.
I have been collaborating with.
You've never written a novel that short in your life, Dave.
I did so.
Collaborating with
Apocalypse Troll is only 84,000 words, so there.
Okay, all right. Proven wrong. But it was a wonderful amount of material to get. It was a really interesting time to jump into the series, because by this time 1634 had gone past, 1635 was well underway, and it was very clear that there were all sorts of things happening. So many integral capabilities that that people of Grantville had now actually, they had not only developed their own capabilities, but these have begun adoption. Sometimes, and this has been a tension within the series, not between any of the three of us, I don't think, but there's a sort of headiness about it. Since we were talking about gamers, there are the sort of optimum gamers, the ones who have the vision of the way it could be, and everything is just going to work. And I kind of sit there and I say, you get out much lately? Yeah, generally not the way things happen. And so one of the earliest scenes, and I'm going to back up to one of the earliest scenes in Commander Cantrell is when they're testing the new guns. They've gone with 8-inch breech loaders, wire wrapped. All of this went back and forth a lot with David and the kind of hull shape and a whole variety of things. One of the major considerations was, and I think David knew he was working with a kindred spirit when he said, now you could do any one of these dozens of things. And I said, what have they already built? You know, and he
Yeah.
said, well, they don't, you know, I said, "Yeah, I think they're going to stick with that and adapt it because essentially that's already proof of concept in combat operations.
Mhm.
Sold, because anything new is going to have a teething problem. And why do you need something new if you can adapt it? Because you are already so far ahead of the leading edge of your adversary in terms of technology. It's going to be so long before they catch up with you. Get it right is more important than build anew. So, so that was one of the first scenes, is that they've got these great new guns and they're shooting them and they're having a problem hitting. They've even got percussion caps on there, but what they don't have is an inclinometer which can fire the weapon at the moment it's on target. And the problem is they're still having to read the swells to try to get it on target. And there's this frustration of, why don't we have these? Well, because, and it's a not a very long statement, but it boils down to, we've got lots of great ideas and not enough stuff. And when you've got lots of great ideas and not enough stuff and never enough money, because we're wanted all over the place, you can't have everything you want. So as very often happens in military situations, we have these great 8-inch guns and we can only use them out to maybe 10% of their potentially effective range because we don't have the way to aim them in the environment. Shelling fortresses, sure. Of course, they never reach you anyhow, but this is what you've got. And what goes on over the course of the two books is a, if you will, a kind of, it never comes to the fore, but there is this background dialogue of everybody's got their hands out in Grantville and beyond. Everybody has a pet project and it all needs the same stuff. Yeah. Good quality steel. Well, as people connected with the series on sort of the research and writing side also, but our indispensable researchers will tell you, there wasn't a lot of iron being made. Steel was a whole other creature. Now you're trying to create a warship with certain elements that are consistent with the 1860s. They're not going to work as well. You got to use iron wherever you can. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is, you never have. It's not just building something on the bleeding edge. It's sort of like saying, well, can we do with brass instead of iron? Can we do with, iron instead of steel?
It's also a factor not simply of the technology that you can manage the materials you can come up with. It's what you can do with the availability of manpower and other resources.
Yep.
Building a Bessemer steel converter isn't all that hard if you have the seed kernel, the seed money to do it. One of the things that I always liked about 1632, the whole approach that Eric had to it, is no, you don't have 14 retired SEALs who just happen to settle down in Grantville. You got to worry about the good old boys figuring out how to do all the special forces stuff and whatnot. I really liked the limiting factor that had been set in place, not simply on we're only going to send one town back, but the town we're going to send back is going to be a real town. It's going to have real strengths, real weaknesses, and the most important resource it has is going to be the library.
Library, yep.
Yeah. And that to me was what created the real working tension in the series. I mean, if he just sent Pittsburgh back, okay, the 17th century wouldn't have stood a chance. All right, I mean, let's face it. Okay, but the way it was, the 17th century still has a fighting chance. And I've the ability to adapt and improvise, to adapt 17th century institutions and technology to more like 20th century applications of it, I think is key to the mindset of these folks. And I think
I would add something in there about the centrality of the library, and I think it's something that perhaps we writers realize, but it may go past really quickly elsewhere. And what I mean by that is that the library, under most circumstances, that conventional wisdom would say, well, if we let other people come into the library, we're going to lose our edge.
Mhm.
But consistent with the characters, consistent with Mike Stern's, but also a sort of clever aspect of this, a shrewdness, which we see it in Mike Stern's and many of these characters, that very often there's in living up to the ideals of the sort of notions of government and independence and sanctity of the individual that have come back with them. There's also a shrewdness. And what I mean by that is, so if the library is open, what potentate is stupid enough to want to go burn it? And doesn't everybody begin to use it? And doesn't that begin to make the people who are just the lesser folk of the era, who are looking on saying, well, wait a minute, these guys from the future, they're kind of putting their money where their mouth is, because anybody can go in and look at it. Well, that's not usually what autocrats do. So maybe there's something to this whole, this very different approach to government and human rights that they have. Maybe there's something to it. And I think it constantly is that discourse.
There's a line in Jerry Pournelle's first Janissaries novel, at the very end of it, where Gwyn is hooking. For those of you who haven't read the books, you really need to. But where Gwyn is getting back with Rick, and I can't remember which one of them that says it, but I never really thought of morality as a survival tool. But the reason that Rick survives and prospers is that he tries to do the right thing.
Yep.
Okay. And that, I think, is a big part of why Grantville survives. And the fact that Gustavus didn't get his butt killed, or a couple other things, didn't hurt. But there's another aspect to it, which is that, and I don't really know that the books have fully dealt with this, is the sheer devastation of the religious wars and whatnot. And here's Grantville in the middle of it saying, there's a different path forward from just killing everybody who doesn't agree with you. And by the way, everything that we can bring you that you can use from the future really depends on creating an environment in which it can be used, and you don't create that environment by killing everybody who doesn't agree with you. And I think that aspect of Grantville, for want of a better term, its humanizing effect on the 17th century is, in my opinion, way bigger than its tech aspects. Although I think it may be its tech aspects that make that part possible by buying them the space and the place to stand while they do it.
Yeah, the reason I did not drop the University of Chicago is that the University of Chicago would not have survived long enough, whereas a small rural coal mining town full of basically blue-collar people who are very skilled in all kinds of ways, and also, as is true of most small towns in the United States, in rural area, anybody's lived in a rural area, which I have, I've had criticisms from some people, always urban dwellers, saying that much as they enjoyed the book, the amount of guns present in a town that size was just absurd,
They should come look at my gun sight.
I did not invent that. When I went to Mannington to do my research, I had a long interview with the police chief, David James, and I asked him to estimate how many guns there were in the area, and it was his estimate that I put in the book. That is not actually unreal. It's what they're like. So that enabled them to survive. But you're absolutely right. The point of the first novel, and it's true of the whole series, and I try anything I write that there's a point to it. I mean, beyond just, it's fun and, it's entertaining, but there's a point underneath it, or more than one. But in one case, one of the things that people, I think, continually underestimate the just sheer strength and resilience of a democratic society. And because there's so much muckiness that goes along with it, which there is, But the fact is that the characteristic of autocratic societies is they're brittle as hell. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years.
Had planning there.
Monstrosity lasted 70 or so, depending on where you count the origins of it. And whereas, and that was partly what was involved with the openness of letting people have access to the books, is it comes to something else, because I've also been criticized for this. People are upset because at the end of the first book, Mike Stearns agrees to a compromise with Gustavus Adolphus, and essentially they agree to what amounts to a constitutional monarchy. And it's really more a constitutional monarchy like you had in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. Gustavus Adolphus has a lot of power. He's not Queen Elizabeth. He has an enormous amount of real power, but I've had people say, "Hey, he should have stuck it out for a republic," and I say, yeah, in that case, he would have had a tiny little republic that would have been a garrison state that would have been constantly under siege. Yeah. Whereas this way, what he does is he creates an enormous amount of political space for not only himself, but for people in general. And he has confidence that which way it'll go, that the forces for democracy will prevail.
I think autocracy's brittleness is directly proportionate to how technological the society is.
I agree with you.
The less technology a society has, the more stable autocracy or at least authoritarian
you're absolutely right about
rule is. And so Grantville is destabilizing the European equation from both sides, right, with the tech and the mindset. But my personal belief is that the only people who can really kill a democratic representative society are the members of that society.
You're right. You're right.
And in that respect, you're talking about where your worst enemy resides, and he's not the guy on the other side of the hill who wants to do you in, because in a technological world, the autocratic states eventually are all going to be roadkill. Okay, it's going to work that way. If you can democracy, representative government is messy as hell. And I think that's actually one of its strengths.
It is.
Because we have to learn how to live with each other. And what Mike does at the end of that first book is to make a pragmatic decision. Okay, this is what we can accomplish. Gustavus isn't going to get everything he wants out of it. I'm not going to get everything that I want out of it, but I am going to discharge my responsibility to safeguard the fundamental physical safety and the autonomy of my Grantville citizens. Okay, and I'm going to build that space that you're talking about, in which this transplanted plant can live and grow. And Mike is smart enough to recognize that if Grantville survives at all, the rest of Europe will have to remake itself to accommodate what Grantville has kicked into the middle of them. And that means that at the end of the day, this American Revolution, 200 years early, is going to thrive if it survives at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce a tangent far away from where we are right now about naval technology.
Oh my God! How dare you pull back on topic?
I tell you, I'm just.
You have no shame at all.
Oh my word! No, well, that's true enough. Right. But before I do that, I want to tell you what's going on the other side of the mirror. If we go back in time a little bit to what David was talking about, he was in Baltic War and the development of the ironclads and all of that technology that he had ready to go in the hands, and then he does this wonderful, kind, patient sort of conveying of that to me. And it was really kind of fun, because I'll tell you, in my experience, I don't get to talk with somebody who has that kind of both military history, breadth and depth, both, and also is just going to geek out on it, through countless emails. So there was the fun of that. Meanwhile, in the background, as Eric said, we met 2009 at Lunicon, which and up in New York. And actually, he actually tried to wave me off. He said, I can't promise that you're going to be published. I can't. I said, it's okay, because I was coming back after a hiatus, and I said, I have an idea. And so he was open with it. He let me run with it. And the first thing I heard about it was, I like it. I'm going to buy it. Don't know where I'm going to use it yet. Now, it was a mission to Trinidad in the New World. And the entire idea was to get Trinidadian oil. But I wrote this, and I brought in some new characters, worked, I think, all with one exception. They were almost everybody in the story. Certainly the primary action arc were downtimers. Not uptimers. It was one up, which at first I was almost disappointed. And Eric said, no, we got enough uptimers. Find some downtimers. And I was like, bless you, because you can only have so many geniuses, hiding out in their basements or out in the open in any town in America. But this is the age of enlightenment, for crying out loud. I have volumes. I have the foundations of so much of what became, our society today in my hands if I want them. And so I certainly did that. But what was actually going on, David, I have to tell you, and I've told Eric this, I think I've told you too, is I was looking at the dance card of one David Weber. And I was saying, how's he going to do this? I mean, new series are coming out, and it's like he writes a book, write a series, and David does not write tiny pamphlets. And thank God, we would all be the sorrow, or the poorer and the sorrier for it. But I looked at this and I said, how's he going to go forward with it? So I said, well, at some point, I think at the very least, help will be needed. So I crafted a story, which was actually a novella. I do that a lot, short stories that sort of grow like Topsy. And
I would have no experience at all with that.
No, I know you don't. None of us do. But I made sure that essentially, I guess you could say, I was auditioning for a role that wasn't even, they weren't even staging that show yet. But I figured that it was a good moment to say, I can do this. And learned a lot. I didn't know what sangrenel was before that. Which, when you get right down to it, is improvised area effect weapon made up a lot of rusty nails when you get right down to it, and other bits of chandlery and things like this. And the sort of, one of the things I liked about the Caribbean was that it was really gritty. And you start reading about the Caribbean, particularly at that time, before you have the notions of lines, Battleship of the Line, which really comes around not too far after 1640, Battle of the Downs, Trump, matter of fact.
Yeah.
I said Trump.
Yeah.
And so that all of this stuff hasn't happened yet. And the way ships are being taken and the way they're being handled and the way they're being commanded is so different from whatever you see in the sort of Napoleonic sort of stuff, or which actually then titrates or perpetuates itself back into, things about the Spanish Armada, which resemble like Trafalgar. And you're saying, once you know,
not so much. No.
And not so much. And so I was able to go with what David gave me. And in the course of that, though, I discovered a couple of things on my own along the way, which have become kind of interesting for me in the books. Fusions for things that were going on. And one of which is I sat there and I said, watching in 1632, there's a fairly rich industry of very, very crude, fairly small steam engines. And I thought about this a lot. And I thought, how many of these, the two hulls that are essentially, if you will, Series 1 and Series 2, that Simpson builds are essentially a slightly a slightly smaller version of the Hartford, at least if you want to think about hulls from the Civil War, and a slightly larger version of the, I guess it's the Kearsarge, I think. Yeah, I think it's the Kearsarge, right? Yes, right.
I think so.
Yeah, and they have, their big claims to fame are their guns on pivot mounts and splitter shields, and you may not know what all these things are, but you can read the books and find out. And but the problem is they can't be every place all at the same time. And I started thinking, and I said, I have to wonder if the real issue. I mean, I'm turned on by the fact that these things they're supposed to do 14 knots. They did in the Civil War. Here, on a good day, they do 12. They usually do 10. But the bottom line, as David was saying, wind at me, that slows me down a little, but I don't have to tack.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about that stuff at all. But what I started thinking about, but what's the value of something if it can only make 2 knots, but constant 2 knots headway? And so one of the things that start happening is engines with essentially frameworks of hulls are getting shipped over to the New World, because the thing that provides tactical mobility for all the ships that are available are the equivalent of ocean-going tugs.
Yeah.
That the idea is you can't use them in the fight, but really when you think about naval combat, particularly when balloons enter the picture, and you can look a lot further away than people were at that time, if you know 10 hours ahead of time where it looks like the engagement is going to take place, and you have tugboats that are able to make, with perfectly good ships of the line of that time, 2 knots that direction, you can always make trouble that the other side just has no response to, even if the wind is good. So it's been a lot of fun. In golf, there's that term, a leave, where the ball is left. And David gave me a great leave. And what was going on in the rest of the series, was just, there have been so many things which dovetailed for me in terms of inventive technology, inventive tactics, things like that, really dovetailed. But last thing is, what became more important than anything else, when you get right down to it, is balloons and radio, and just telegraphy, frankly. Telegraphy and radio and balloons, that changes everything.
Well, actually, the most critical aspect of all of this is the different understanding of health and diet.
That's very important too.
Yeah, back in the 18th century, in the Caribbean, the sickly season, was guaranteed to give you career advancement, assuming that you survived,
Yes.
because so many people were going to die of yellow jack or one of the other diseases. This is 1632 is pre Captain Cook and the lime juice. And so simply knowing, okay, you have to be sure you get your ascorbic acid and you have to do all the rest of this, had a huge impact on what the guys in the 1632 universe could do, as opposed to what would have happened in a universe without Grantville. And one of the things that the whole series has been very good about, is showing sort of knock-on effects.
Yep.
One of the things that one variety of alternate history that I just really, really dislike is the one in which you assume that you're going to change one factor and everything else is going to be the same that it was. Okay. If you change one factor, you change all factors. Even leaving aside, quantum physics and, all these possible reactions are going to work out slightly differently from the way they did, including where the leaf is going to fall when it comes down from the tree or whatever. When you start mucking around and introducing new capabilities, one of the things I will guarantee you is going to happen is that it's going to take you in directions you didn't think it was going to take you in when it created the story. The other thing that's going to happen is that the people living in the society that these changes have been introduced into are going to find their own ways to capitalize on them. And that's really what the whole 1632 series is about, is here you have the downtimers who are recognizing opportunity and going for it. It's not just the Richters of this universe. Okay, it's anybody. And I think perhaps the most revolutionary single aspect of Grant Bill's return or its transit to 1632 is the sense permeating and spreading from it that anyone can do this stuff. Okay, that knowledge doesn't care whose brain it lives in or what the pedigree of the brain it lives in might be. And in that sense, these are incredibly optimistic books. And I don't say that they are falsely optimistic. What I am saying is that they, villains aside, okay, these books are a tribute to an essentially optimistic, positive view of humanity. And I think that's one reason why they succeed as well as they have succeeded. And I think if you look at some of the characters that we've built, like Mike Starnes, like Simpson, like Eddie, okay, you see that same sort of element in there. And all these folks they're not only basically good, decent, capable human beings, but they are people who are stepping up into performing at levels that many of them probably never imagined they could, because it's their job to do that under the circumstances that they face.
That's one of the fun things about writing Eddie, because this individual was somebody who he never thought he was going to go to college, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Now he's Danish nobility twice over.
Yes.
It's heady stuff.
We've already run close to 10 minutes over, so I got to wrap this up.
Oh, darn.
Yeah, I know. Just one thing I want to say, for anyone who is interested in finding out what is going to be unfolding in the future with Naval and other things, and if you don't mind spoilers, then come to the last session of the convention, which we call Snirking the Plots, and, which is, I don't even know where that bird came from, but basically, we will tell you what's going to be happening in a series in several books to come, and there will be some spoilers. But you also are sworn to silence, and terrible things will happen if you break that. And that will be the final panel of the convention on Sunday. And I will be at it, so will Chuck, so will some other authors, and we will discuss some of what we'll be doing, what Chuck and I will be doing in the next book we're going to do together. Okay, and thank you all for coming, and please stick around for the autographing session that will follow, assuming you want an autograph. Okay, thank you.